She stared intently at the dark water beneath her feet, where the moonlight reflected only a fragment of her face, a face no one remembered anymore. Who am I, if even my mother no longer knows who I am? Amina whispered, her voice breaking like waves crashing against rocks. That night, in the Bayou La Batre swamp, as she prepared to let go of the last black pearl of her memory, a cold hand emerged from the water and grasped her. It was Solari, the mermaid with eyes glowing golden like the sun setting after a storm. Memories don't vanish, they are stolen, she said, then sank back into the water, leaving a shimmering light in Amina's heart like a forgotten oath. That was the moment Amina knew. If she didn't reclaim herself, no one would. And from that moment, she began her journey back to Willow Bend, a place where no one remembered her name, but she would force them to remember. Once upon a time, in a black village along the Mississippi River called Willow Bend, there was a legend whispered among the people. When a child's cry causes the forest trees to shed their leaves, that child carries an extraordinary destiny. Amina was born during the great storm of that year, a night when the wind tore through thatched roofs, lightning ripped the chest of the sky, and the river overflowed like the lament of ancestors. The midwife recounted that when the baby let out her first cry, it not only brought tears to her mother's eyes, but also caused the trees around the village to shed their leaves like rain. That little girl grew up in the shade of the Hammond family, a lineage revered as the deep roots of this land. They were the first to gain freedom, the pioneers of farming, the ones who opened literacy classes for Black children after emancipation, and the keepers of native traditions that the villagers believed held something sacred. Amina was the brightest jewel of the family, the first to receive a full medical scholarship to New Orleans. She left for school at 15, carrying a promise made before the ancestral altar. When I return, I will heal. But her return was not as her heart had envisioned. After 10 years, Willow Bend was no longer the peaceful village of her memories. The old community hall where the elders played dominoes was now covered in dust, with the smell of mold lingering on the wooden walls. The river had a heavy stench, murky and thick, with layers of algae and sediment. Children bore persistent sores around their ankles. Many dropped out of school due to prolonged fevers. Amina walked along the red dirt road that once led her to school, her heart heavy as stone. Each step raised a silent question. What had happened to the place that once called her its hope? When she reached the gate of the family church, where portraits of ancestors once hung on the wooden walls, she stopped. There was no picture of her father, no picture of her. The small stone plaque engraved with the Hammond family name out front was buried under wild vines. The cemetery keeper looked at her as if she were a stranger. When she hesitantly said her name, he only smiled awkwardly. Sorry, whose relative are you? The feeling of being severed from her roots was as if a part of her blood had stopped flowing. But the most painful moment came when she stepped into the old house where her mother once lived and called softly through the wooden doorframe, "Mother, I'm back." A middle-aged woman emerged, her hair gray, her figure frail. It was her mother. But she looked at Amina like a passerby, her eyes empty, without a trace of recognition. Amina stood frozen. She smiled, recounting the dishes her mother used to cook, the small scars on her mother's hands that she once tended to, but her mother only stepped back silently and closed the door. Amina left the house in a cold shock. She wandered all afternoon, trying to find an old friend, a relative, anyone who could confirm she was herself, but everyone shook their heads. And then, as the sun set, someone appeared. It was Corey, her cousin, the one who used to pedal her to school on his bike when they were young, who once called her future doctor's sister with shining eyes. He stood before the village council at an emergency meeting held that very night. No greeting, no embrace. Only an accusation read aloud in the wooden room, echoing with the creak of the ceiling fan. "The person standing before us is not Amina Hammond," Corey declared firmly, his voice cold as steel. "This person has sneaked into the village, bringing poisons and curses. The plague in the village is because of her. Protect Willow Bend from this imposter." A few eyes turned toward Amina, eyes she could hardly believe, filled with fear, suspicion, then turning to hostility. No one stood up to speak in her defense. No one asked a question. Relatives, people who once gave her candy as a child, who carried her on their backs to the fair, now looked at her as if she were a foreign object, a calamity from somewhere unknown. That same night, Amina was locked in the old storage shed behind the community hall, a damp darkness where rotting wood and rusted chains seemed to bury the last of her faith. She sat there, not crying, only wondering, if the place that loved her most had turned its back, what did she have left? Have you ever been turned away by your own kin, believing a lie about you instead of the truth you tried to hold on to? Don't go anywhere, for what happened behind those bars will make you believe in miracles and in truths no one dares to speak. That night's moon was full, but its light was dim, like the last flicker of faith in Amina's heart. The rotting wooden walls around her echoed with the sound of termites gnawing, and the wind whistling through the cracks sounded like whispers of the departed. The cell behind the ancestral hall, once a place for storing Bibles and moral teachings, had now become a prison for the very daughter of the family once entrusted with their greatest hopes. The trial the next day took place under the weathered wooden roof, before a village council of people who once called her niece or cousin in her childhood. But today, no one remembered. No one stood to question. The evidence presented was a family genealogy without her name, a family photograph without her face. A diary from her father declared a forgery. In a voice as quiet as ash, the elder seated in the center delivered the final verdict. This person does not belong here. She brings chaos, disease, and division. Willow Bend has no place for one who does not belong. In the midst of the silence, a single hand gently squeezed Amina's a wrinkled but warm hand, like embers not yet extinguished. It was Maisie, the old nursemaid who once carried Amina on her back, singing lullabies in the sweltering summer afternoons. Silently, Maisie stepped forward, saying nothing, and pressed a small, cold object into Amina's hand, a fragment of black pearl, faintly etched with words almost illegible. "Remember the water? Where you were born." Amina didn't understand, but she couldn't ask. Maisie was pulled away immediately afterward by two young men. The village no longer allowed a senile old woman to muddle the line between right and wrong. And so, in the misty early morning of the next day, Amina was banished from Willow Bend. No ceremony, no farewell, no document or explanation of her identity. She was taken away on a small truck, seated among old baskets and crates, as if she were mere discarded cargo. Her destination was Bayou La Batre, a deep, endless swamp in Alabama, where fog clung to the water's surface all day, where people lived by shrimping and lit oil lamps in precarious floating homes. No one asked why she came. They only looked at her with wary eyes, as if she carried a storm with her. On her third day in this strange land, Amina followed a slippery mud path down to an old dock. There, a rotting fishing boat tilted precariously, much like her own life. She sat at the bow, gazing into the pitch-black water, flowing slowly as if each memory was being drained from her heart. Amina pulled the black pearl fragment from her coat pocket, its faint gleam reflecting on the water. She whispered to herself, "What water? Born where? If not Willow Bend, then who am I?" But the water didn't answer, nor did the moon, Only a gentle breeze swirled around her hair, carrying the scent of marsh grass and the cold breath of buried memories. In that moment, a thought flickered, then grew like fire spreading through dry fields. If no one remembered her, if no place acknowledged her existence, then perhaps she had no reason to go on. She leaned forward. Her feet slipped from the boat's edge. The pearl slipped from her hand, glinting under the moonlight, and then something happened. The water stirred, softly, very softly, then stronger. The still surface suddenly broke into widening ripples. From the depths of the inky water, an arm reached up white as moonlight, soft as silk. And in that moment, Amina was no longer alone. A being was there, golden eyes blazing brightly, hair flowing like sea moss, and radiant golden scales stretching along a sinuous form. A mermaid, but not like in fairy tales. She didn't sing. She didn't smile. She only looked straight at Amina with eyes full of understanding. Without words, Amina knew. This being knew who she was. And then the mermaid raised her hand, lightly touching Amina's forehead. A cool sensation spread down her spine. In that moment, every sound in her mind stopped. No more judgments, no more accusations. Only one phrase echoed from deep within her heart. Don't forget the water. Don't forget yourself. All right, my dear audience, get ready to dive into a mysterious tale where memories are stolen, a golden-scaled mermaid appears, and the truth awaits to be unveiled in the swamps of the American South. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always exciting to see our family connecting across the world. The swamp's water was eerily still. Wisps of fog draped across it like an endless funeral veil stretching between sky and surface. Amina lay motionless on the rotting boat, her hair drenched, her skin cold as if the water had drained the life from her veins. The surrounding silence was chilling, broken only by the faint beating of her heart, torn open by despair and betrayal. A gust of wind passed through. The small black pearl fragment rolled from her hand, falling into the water with a sound so faint it seemed almost non-existent. In that moment, an unusual movement began to ripple from the depths of the dark swamp. The water stirred in circles, at first small, like the breath of waves, then growing larger, opening into a shimmering patch of light as if the sky's fabric had been torn. From the nameless depths of the swamp, a form emerged, fluid and soft like a silken ribbon of gold. Amina opened her eyes, and she saw her a being half human, half water, alive like moonlight, reflected on a lake at midnight. This mermaid did not appear like the dazzling legends in storybooks, but as a part of this place, of its pain and memories, of the swamp and all that had been forgotten. Her skin glowed with an ivory sheen, as if woven from finely ground pearl, mingled with the dust of wind and mist. The scales on her body were like living gold, each one radiant as if forged from the metal, reflecting formless fragments of memory in Amina's mind. It was not a haughty beauty, but the beauty of a primal soul, ancient, forgiving, and understanding. Amina couldn't move, couldn't speak, but her eyes widened, holding both fear and a faith she couldn't name. The mermaid silently rose higher above the water, her long hair cascading like the roots of a great tree soaked in sacred waters. Her eyes locked onto Amina's, and in that gaze, there was no accusation, no pity, only a confirmation that Amina had once been part of something greater. Without words, something from the mermaid began to transfer. A stream of images flickered in Amina's mind. The peaceful willow bend of old, fields of white cotton under the sunlight, voices calling her name as she ran through the wooden gate of the Hammond house, the soft chime of the church bell every Sunday. Then it all dissolved, as if blown away by an invisible smoke. Familiar faces blurred, beloved voices replaced by silence. And finally, darkness surging like a flood, smothering everything that once was memory. The mermaid lifted her head, and Amina saw a glow flash across her forehead, an ancient carved pattern, like a sacred symbol from a time no one remembered. Then, in a moment that felt like 1,000 years, a cool breath slid from the mermaid's skin to Amina's. It wasn't the cold of water, but a chill that made her heart tremble, as if long-buried memories were being awakened. Solari, that was the name that surfaced in Amina's mind, as if the mermaid had sent it to her not through words, but through a deeper, more primal rhythm, the pulse of the soul. Solari was not merely a strange being. She was a living memory, the keeper of things humanity had forgotten, the guardian of truths buried by indifference. She was the embodiment of what Willow Bend had lost. And she had been there long before Amina was born, waiting for someone brave enough to remember. Amina now understood. Willow Bend hadn't betrayed her out of malice. They were ensnared. They were bound in a haze of the call of forgetting, an ancient curse, silent as fog but destructive as a wildfire. It didn't kill. It simply erased. Erased what was once real, a forced forgetting, slowly corroding memory and identity. Solari imparted a simple truth, wordlessly. Only those who still loved were affected most deeply by the curse. The more they loved, the more vulnerable they were when memory was twisted. And only the one bearing the deepest wound had the strength to find the way back. But to break the call of forgetting, shouting the truth wasn't enough. Justice couldn't be claimed through anger. Amina had to forgive. Not because the betrayers deserved it, but because holding on to pain too long would turn her into the very thing she fought against. Solari's hand lightly touched Amina's forehead. A warmth spread through her. No light, no dazzling magic, just a clear sensation that Amina was still whole. She hadn't vanished. And as long as a part of her still remembered who she was, hope was not yet extinguished. Solari sank back into the water, leaving the surface smooth as a mirror and a trail of golden scales floating behind. Amina sat there, her hands trembling slightly, no longer from despair but from something greater. She could reclaim the truth. The morning sun filtered through the Alabama swamp trees like golden threads stitching up an old, tattered coat. On the red dirt road leading back to Willow Bend, a woman walked quietly. A wide-brimmed hat shaded half her face. A white blouse, old but clean, was draped over one arm. The other hand clutched a leather bag containing vials of medicine, a notebook, and a faded stethoscope. No one recognized her. No one recognized the eyes that once belonged to the Hammond girl of years past, the eyes that had once gazed at this village with all the pride of her ancestral blood. Amina had returned, but not as Amina the rejected daughter, branded a curse. She was now Dr. A. Holloway, a physician from Mobile, answering a call for medical aid following reports of an unidentified epidemic spreading around the river. No one questioned her identity. The curse had faded memories of Amina so thoroughly that the villagers could no longer conjure her true face. In their eyes, she was just a kind stranger. And for the first time in years, that became her advantage. Amina went from house to house, carrying a gentle silence and a deeply observant gaze. The children gaunt, with festering sores around their ankles. Many with clouded eyes took the small pills she offered as if they were magic. The elderly hands trembling, memories scrambled, called out the wrong names of loved ones, mistaking years and months. But what choked her most wasn't the illness. It was the emptiness in the village's eyes, where a land of memories once thrived, now a fogged village, deaf to the call from within. At night, she sat by the river, the light of an oil lamp casting shadows on a face no longer as it once was, no longer innocent, but deepened with experience. She recorded every symptom, every location, every sign, like a gatekeeper of memory, quietly mending fragments of truth. And then she discovered something unusual. The water, once crystal clear, drawn directly from the river by the villagers, was now heavily contaminated with substances that damaged the nervous system and weakened immunity. She took samples, conducted basic tests with the tools she carried, and cross-referenced them with old medical texts. The conclusion was clear: the river was being systematically poisoned, not by natural pollution, not by disaster, but by deliberate human intervention. She dug through old flyers in the village hall, reports on river and reservoir research, land exploitation permits, and then, in a dusty file, she saw the name Corey T. Hammond. Signed, sealed, approved, and funded by a chemical company from another state in exchange for the right to survey traditional water microorganisms. She couldn't believe her eyes. Corey, the cousin who once looked at her with admiration, who called her the village's light, had signed the order that brought death to their motherland. And not only that, he had invoked the call of forgetting, manipulating the community, sowing fear, and gradually erasing every opposing memory. Amina realized this wasn't just betrayal. It was a plot to destroy the soul of an entire community. She had all the evidence: recordings, signatures, medical records, logs of pathological reactions, everything. But the truth couldn't remain confined to her notebook. It needed to be spoken. Publicly, before the entire village. Amina knew. Doing so might lead to her being captured again, branded a troublemaker, an outsider. But she was no longer afraid. This time, she wasn't fighting to be remembered. She was fighting for them to remember themselves. Once again, she stood before the village hall. But this time, not with trembling hands seeking her identity. She stood with the resolute voice of someone who had returned from the depths of the water, who had heard the truth from deeper than the surface. Have you ever discovered a loved one behind a crime? And if you held the truth in your hands, would you dare speak it, knowing it could cost you everything? The early autumn sunlight fell gently on the field behind the old wooden church, where Willow Bend's fall festival was taking place. The aroma of roasted corn and smoked sweet potatoes filled the air, mingling with the laughter from traditional games and the familiar hymns. It seemed like a peaceful day, like those of years past, but something in the atmosphere felt strange. In the crowd, no one recognized the woman dressed in a simple black dress, a long coat covering her shoulders, and a small necklace worn close to her chest, its pendant, the very black pearl fragment Maisie had once given her. She walked slowly, each step matching the rhythm of her own heartbeat, moving toward the wooden platform where the pastor was preparing to conclude the prayer. On the altar, the cross remained silent, but below, hundreds of eyes, those of former classmates, neighbors, even kin, knelt in the traditional ritual, heads bowed, hands clasped tightly. None knew that in just a few moments, a shockwave would ripple through their memories. Amina stepped onto the platform. No one introduced her. No music signaled her arrival. Only a fragile silence fell, separating her from the rest of the world. She didn't shout. She didn't cry out. She simply placed a small projector on the wooden table, opened her old leather bag, and pulled out her notebook filled with notes on illnesses, test samples, evidence, and a memory card attached to the projector's side. When the first image appeared, everything went still. A blurry video flickered to life. It showed Corey Amina's cousin sitting in a meeting with representatives from the chemical company. Fragmented voices echoed, "West River extraction route, anonymous agreement, no community backlash, signatures, stamps, handshakes." Then the footage shifted to photographs, children lying motionless on beds with festering sores, elderly people trembling, unable to recognize their own kin. And then, death certificates no one had ever mentioned, buried quietly under layers of administrative dust. Amina didn't need to explain further. The crowd's eyes began to lift, shifting from indifference to confusion, from doubt to shock. A whisper rose from the pews. "Is that Mrs. Lewis? Didn't she pass last year because—" Amina's hand lightly touched the necklace. "I am Amina Hammond." Her voice rang through the space like a knock on the door of their hearts. "You may have forgotten me, but this land, this blood, this river have never forgotten anyone. Willow Bend knows who lives truly and who hides the cruelest deeds under a respectable suit." There was no protest, no shouting, only the sound of a community's heartbeats in unison, strong, erratic, and beginning to remember. Then, from the back pew, a figure stood. It was Maisie, her silver hair trembling but her eyes brighter than ever. She walked forward slowly, needing no cane, no support, and when she reached Amina, she knelt. Not out of repentance, but in recognition. The second to stand was a woman who had once denied Amina as kin, her eyes red, clutching a Bible tightly. Then a third, a fourth. The pews stirred like waves. And finally, the entire church stood silent, just standing, facing her, the one they had once rejected. Now they didn't see a stranger. They saw the severed piece of their own memories returned at last. The air was no longer charged with anger. It was an awakening. But the one person who didn't stand was Corey. He sat to the right, beneath the council table, hands clenched, face pale, no defense, no false smile, only a silent collapse. Amina hadn't returned for revenge. She had returned to restore Willow Bend's soul. And now, with the truth laid bare, she understood the greatest miracle didn't come from Solari, nor from the Black Pearl, but from the heart of the community when it dared to remember, dared to face itself, and dared to heal. Dear audience, grab a glass of water and keep listening to this story. The twists are far from over. Comment 1 if you're loving this tale, so we know you're still with us. The early morning breeze swept through the eucalyptus groves north of Willow Bend, carrying the scent of fresh grass, damp earth, and the river awakening after a quiet night. The air was peaceful, but in the heart of each villager, something had just been stirred. Truth, memory, and a pang of regret upon realizing that, for so long, they had lived amid invisible wounds no one dared to face. After the previous day's ceremony, where all lies were laid bare, an emergency village meeting was held at the ancient wooden hall at the heart of the community. Once the center of power, then left to decay, it now reclaimed its original purpose, a place where people could look into each other's eyes and speak the truth. Amina didn't sit in the front row. She chose a small chair in the corner, near the door opening to the cotton field behind. Light streaming through the door's cracks fell on her clasped hands, as if she still hadn't released the layers of memory she had just unearthed. Before her were those who had once called her name with joy in childhood, then rejected her in collective fear. Now they sat there, eyes downcast, shoulders hunched, as if the returning memories were too heavy to embrace all at once. No one cried, no one shouted. There were only heavy sighs and ballots passed through trembling hands. The vote to remove Corey from his leadership role and nullify all river exploitation contracts with the foreign company took place in an eerie silence. Each person wrote, folded their paper, and approached the wooden box in the center of the hall, as if performing a cleansing ritual. The result surprised no one. Corey was deposed. All prior agreements were declared void. A new civilian council was formed, its power truly resting in the hands of those once forgotten, the farmers, the single mothers, the elders who had survived 3 generations. And above all, the water, the soul of Willow Bend, was now protected by the very community it had once nourished. Then it was Amina's turn to be called to the platform. A middle-aged woman, hands trembling as she held a nomination paper, spoke in a hoarse voice. Amina should be the leader. Not because they owed her, but because she was the only one who still remembered the village's worth when everyone else had forgotten. Amina stepped up slowly. The breeze from the open door behind her brushed the hem of her dress, as if reminding her that this choice was no longer personal. It was a charge from the land, from the ancestors, from Solari herself. She didn't need many words. She only placed her hand on her heart, where the black pearl still hung, like a small pulse connecting past and present, and spoke with the quiet resolve of someone who had walked through the abyss. She declined, not with anger, not with rejection, but with a faint smile, like moonlight reflecting on calm waters after a storm. She didn't need to lead. She hadn't come to rule. She had come to remember for them until they remembered themselves. Her gaze then turned to the far corner of the hall where Corey sat alone, hands limp, eyes like those of someone emerging from a dream with no beginning or end. Amina didn't avoid that gaze. She walked toward him, not fast, not slow as she once had when leading him across the village path years ago, when they were children dreaming of changing their home. He bowed his head, but sensing her presence, he looked up. No one heard what she said. They only saw Corey's eyes shift from clouded to wet. And for the first time, he cried not because he was exposed, but because he was forgiven. Amina turned away, silently, lightly, as if each step no longer carried any shadow. Behind her, the community remained quiet, but in that silence, something was beginning to sprout. Trust, unity, and a true chance to heal from the roots. What do you think? Is forgiveness, weakness, or the only true strength to rebuild a wounded world? That night, after the last rays of sunlight retreated from the willows along the river, Amina sat alone on the old rock outcrop where she had once been imprisoned amid doubt and oblivion. Her feet lightly touched the cool water. The water was no longer murky or reeking of poison, but clear as crystal, the moonlight casting glints like sequins across its surface. But Solari was no longer there. Since the morning after the festival, after the day the village was awakened, the golden-scaled mermaid had not reappeared. No sign, no ripple, no whisper echoing from the river's depths as before. At first, Amina thought she was dreaming. Each morning at the swamp's edge, she placed her hand on the water, softly singing the old lullaby, the one Maisie used to sing to lull her to sleep, the one Solari had returned to her during their first encounter. But the water only reflected her image. No Solari, no response. Then she understood. Solari hadn't vanished. She had fulfilled her purpose. When the village reclaimed its memories, when its people returned to the light, she was no longer needed. Solari didn't belong to a place that had awakened. She came only to those lost in the fog of forgetting at the boundary between water and memory. Amina didn't cry. She wasn't sad. She only nodded quietly to herself and sat still for a long time, as if waiting for the water to whisper one last time. The next day, the bayou swamp began to change. The toxic algae that once covered the water's surface gradually dissolved. Small shrimp and fish returned, swimming close to the banks, no longer wary as before. Village children gathered at the river's edge to play, splashing in old wooden boats once forgotten behind the cattle sheds. And then something miraculous happened. From somewhere, the children began singing an old lullaby. Their clear voices, unprompted, blended in harmony. Bayou calls your name. Don't forget. The water remembers you. The heart knows your name. Amina froze when she heard the words. She had never taught anyone that song, but it was the very melody Maisie used to sing to lull her to sleep. The same song she had forgotten until Solari sang it from the water. It was as if the entire village had remembered. Not just Amina, but memory itself had returned. At the church, where the Hammond family portrait had been taken down after Amina's disappearance, it was now rehung. No dust, no fading, placed solemnly alongside past generations, as if the time of rejection had never existed. In the old, once-abandoned house where Amina was born, the villagers pooled money to repair the roof, rebuild the columns, and replant the grapevines that had shaded the summer porch. No one organized it, they said, but everyone wanted the place to live again, a silent act of atonement. And on a crystal-clear morning, with mist still clinging to the grass, a group of young villagers knocked on the door of Amina's new home, carrying maps, notebooks, and pieces of cloth embroidered with names. They asked her to teach them. They didn't call her doctor. They didn't call her leader. They called her the one who tells of things forgotten. Amina smiled. She understood. That was the greatest gift Solari had left behind, not the glow of golden scales, not prophecy or supernatural power, but the ability for a community to remember itself. And if you've ever lost something that seemed gone forever, you'll understand that remembering isn't just a miracle, it's a resurrection. There are mornings in life we never forget, not because anything extraordinary happens, but because they are so peaceful, as if time itself pauses to breathe with our hearts. For Amina, that morning was one such day. The chirping of birds rustled softly on the eaves of the small house. The smell of roasted corn drifted from the neighbor's home, mingling with the gentle clinking of the wind chime Maisie had once hung by the window. Willow Bend wasn't just reborn. It had quietly shed its old skin. Children laughed brightly in the yard. Adults rolled up their sleeves to replant vegetable patches. Beneath the earth, sweet water veins began to flow again, soothing old wounds as if the motherland itself was apologizing. Amina sat on the porch, her notebook open on her lap. The blank pages were gradually filled not with data or evidence, but with stories. Fragments of memories she had gathered throughout her journey from the rainy night in the prison cell to Solari's final gaze in the depths of the swamp. She didn't write to keep them for herself. She wrote to pass them on to the next generation the children once taught to forget. In this village, everyone now knew who she was. But more importantly, they remembered who they themselves had once been. That afternoon, a small ceremony was held by the water's edge. No trumpets, no drums, only white cotton flower symbols of the past released onto the swamp. The villagers gathered, reading aloud the names of those lost to illness, the victims of silence. Amina didn't speak, but she placed a small stone by the water's edge, a quiet thank you to Solari. As dusk fell, the sunlight filtered through the calm water, casting a shimmering glow like golden scales rippling beneath the swamp's surface. No one spoke, but in their eyes was a silent agreement. Solari was still here, in every sip of clean water they drank, in every memory returned. Amina didn't stay in the small house much longer. She gave it to a young couple new to the village, people who had once left Willow Bend but returned after hearing the story of the woman who wasn't forgotten. She took with her the old leather bag, the notebook, and the black pearl fragment now no longer glowing, but to her, it had fulfilled its purpose. She left the village with a gentle farewell, not because she was driven away, but because she knew Willow Bend could now walk on its own. Amina didn't go far. She sought out other communities, places still asleep in doubt, where children no longer sang lullabies, where rivers had run dry of memory. She became a storyteller, not a doctor, not a leader, just someone who reminded people of what they once had, once loved, once were. At every place she went, she planted a question. Do you still remember who you were before the world told you to forget? And each time that question was asked, a door opened. Not a door to a house, but a door in the heart. This is not just Amina's story. It is a whisper for anyone who has been rejected, denied, or erased from the hearts of those they loved most. If you've ever had to prove your worth, been dismissed despite your efforts, or felt the pain of no one seeing who you truly are, you understand. Forgiveness is not weakness. Remembering is not easy. But only by facing what was lost can we begin to truly live again. Not everyone can become an icon, but everyone can be a spark, whether in a narrow alley or amidst a forgotten swamp. Amina's story doesn't close like an ending, but opens like a stream, continuing to flow, to spread, to touch the parched veins of land cracked by neglect. Somewhere a new river is stirring. It might be a strange town where children's songs have fallen silent. It might be a community sinking into oblivion. Or perhaps it's your own heart, a place that once trusted, once loved, once was wounded, and is now learning to forgive. If you feel something shifting within you, then the journey isn't over. It's only just begun anew in a different form. Leave a comment if you've ever lost yourself. Share this story with someone who needs to be remembered. And if you want to meet Amina again, to know where she goes next, what her next journey holds, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because sometimes the greatest miracle happens only to those patient enough to listen to the story until the very last drop of water. And are you ready for part 2 if you believe that memories never truly vanish?